Good morning, class. I'm going to get right back at it here. We've been talking today, this week we've been talking about how the emergence of industrial capitalism and the emergence of nation states in the West and Europe and the emergence of colonization or colonialism. All three of these forces are, as a result of the Industrial Revolution, they have all been intensified across the globe. And this week we've been talking about how the core, meaning the source of these ideas, the region or regions of the world that are exporting industrial capitalism, nation states, and colonialism, exporting it or exerting it upon other parts of the world, the peripheries, as we've mentioned in class. We're talking about how this has created, in some ways, a backlash or pushback, alternative visions, protest movements, folks who are frustrated or not satisfied with the new order as it's coming into focus around the world. And today our main focus, interestingly enough, is looking at how opponents of industrial capitalism, even within Europe, even within the core, are making their case and putting that forth. And in the case of today, as we look at Karl Marx and the emergence of Marxism, which is oftentimes referred to as communism, although technically Marxism is a specific version of communism. We're going to look at how that's emerged, and that's of course going to play a critical role in later chapters of world history as well. So we're building our framework. In class, we discussed, whoops, my bad. We discussed some questions about from our source, Proudhon, who is a critic, probably would have had lots in common with Karl Marx, although the two of them did disagree on some points. But the assignment from the primary reader today was designed to get you thinking in a really dramatically different way. And there were intellectuals like Proudhon in the mid-19th century, writing in 1840, who just disputed and refuted the idea of private property altogether. And we took a little time answering these questions in class. And if these questions are overly mysterious to you, I would encourage you to revisit that reading in your primary reader. And you're also welcome to come talk to me in office hours about these and other issues. But the heart of what I want to accomplish today is just a few minutes worth of comments that I didn't get to in class because we watched the documentary on Masters of Money, Karl Marx. And so, you know, our focus, our objective here is how did people in the early 1800s and mid 1800s, how did they effectively try to challenge the industrial capital order that was coming down the pipe? And Karl Marx is one of a number of different expressions that are taking place throughout the world that are challenging this new trend, this momentum of the Industrial Revolution. And it's probably also the most famous and the most lasting, so we want to make sure we have a familiarity with him. Okay, so his alternative vision, yeah, he wants something different, and he, as mentioned in the documentary, he envisions a world that does not have industrial capitalism. Even though industrial capitalism, Marx would admit there are certain things about this system that are beneficial and highly effective, but he ultimately thinks it's a bad thing. And specifically, I want to point out some of the issues that emerge from industrial capitalism, according to Marx and the other opponents of industrial capitalism. So first off is the social question, and you know, really starting late 1700s, early 1800s, as the consequences and impacts of industrial capitalism are becoming more widely felt and more widely understood, many people, particularly throughout Europe, are asking themselves, so what's the appropriate response? Industrial capitalism has reconfigured, it has sort of reset the social relationships and social function of modern society. But is that it? I mean, is there a role for, say, government, or is there a role for businesses themselves to take to sort of address some of the inequalities and hardships that are being caused by this new industrial order? And so this question very much occupied people, and Europeans would have had a number of different answers depending on who you asked. The answer would have likely been different. There were some who believed, as the Enlightenment economic philosopher Adam Smith would have put forth, that you just let the invisible hand run its course, and any intervention by society or government is simply a needless obstacle and needless barrier to the otherwise efficient function of markets. But I put this here because the social question was something that many people were asking, and essentially it meant, how can we, or what should we do, if anything, to address the challenges posed by industrial capitalism? One very clear expression was that the income gap between the wealthy, the bourgeoisie, and the working class, the proletariat, was growing at a ever-widening, it was growing, there was an ever-widening gap between the bourgeoisie and the working class, and income disparity was growing tremendously. And so this was a question of, is this fair? And in truth, the income gap today is as great, or if not greater, than what it was in Marx's time. And people today ask that question. The idea that administrative or bourgeoisie managers, that their income might be hundreds of times, in case of CEOs, thousands of times greater than the entry-level worker. At what point is too much too much? Or is that just the way it needs to be, a completely unmanaged, unregulated gap in people's earnings? But these were issues that industrial capitalism brought to bear, and questions that people asked. The Communist Manifesto, of course, was a very important tract that Karl Marx and his colleague Friedrich Engels wrote. It was published in 1848, right in the middle of this period of time we're exploring this week in Chapter 16. And the Communist Manifesto was primarily a diagnosis of the problems of industrial capitalism, but it also had a little bit of a prescription, maybe a plan. And the plan was for workers to unite and find their strength in numbers, and to rise up and resist the growing power of the bourgeoisie. And Marx saw this as inevitable, that the forces of capitalism, as great as they are in some respects, were ultimately going to take the economy and take industrial capitalism on an unsustainable path, and that ultimately the workers would overtake their capitalist managers, the bourgeoisie, and things would be solved. The division of labor was another feature of this new industrial capitalism, the idea that tasks or crafts that were once entrusted to one or just a few individuals, for example, the making of a shoe, which would have been done by a cobbler in pre-industrial times. Cobbler would cut the sole, would cut the leather, would stitch it all together, would stitch the shoe together, lace the shoes, so on and so forth. Well, in an industrial context, of course, all of those small tasks of, in this case, shoe production, are going to be outsourced to different individuals, and there's a certain efficiency that comes with that. But there's also Marx would have referred to this as an alienation of labor, meaning the laborer, the person producing the shoe, is now no longer given the satisfaction of completing a task like shoe construction. Instead, they're limited to such a small part of the shoe producing process that they do not have that feeling of satisfaction. And he would have called this a source of alienation. Again, made possible by the division of labor, which becomes very sophisticated and very developed as a result of industrial capitalism. Now we have the question of liberty and equality, right? We've just recently gone through the Enlightenment process, the American Revolution, the French Revolution. These were largely conversations about political liberty and political equality. But Marxists are asking the question of, to what degree can people be free and be equal if the economy in which they exist is so consists of such gaps and there are such differences in the ownership and access to capital. And so this question, I think, is still with us about to what degree one can be politically free and equal when economically they are anything but. Proletarians, hopefully you have a good grasp of that term. The proletariat, or the proletarians, are the working class individuals in Marx's analysis of industrial capitalism. They become, for him, the heroes of the story that rise up against their counterparts, the bourgeoisie. And in Marx's analysis, they will ultimately take control of the industrial system and thereby correct the excesses of capitalism. And then finally, again, revolution. For Marx, this is how this will work. I will just close by saying that, it would seem at this point that Marx's predictions about capitalism do not come true and will not come true. Of course, it's tough to say that across the board, right? It's possible that some of his predictions could still come true in the future. But the other thing that's worth noting is that capitalism has undergone a fair amount of reform, and there have been corrections made. There are few places on the globe today that actually practice a true capitalism. Government regulation is a part of most capitalist economic systems, and therefore you could argue that while revolution hasn't happened, reform has happened, and capitalism has been rendered kinder and gentler through that process. So anyway, with that, we'll take a break, and I'll look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Thanks.